June 15, 1944. The volcanic slopes of Saipan, Mariana Islands. The radio operator crouched in a shell crater, his hands steady despite the mortar fire that walked across the ridgeline above him. Around him, Marines pressed themselves into the black volcanic sand, waiting for the next wave of Japanese counterattack that would come with the darkness. The operator's voice, when it came, was calm and rhythmic, speaking words that sounded like no language the Japanese listening posts had ever encountered. The syllables flowed in patterns that defied cryptographic analysis, that resisted every attempt at translation, that seemed to shift and reorganize with each transmission. To the Japanese intelligence officers hunched over their receivers 300 yards away, furiously transcribing every sound, the transmission was incomprehensible noise. To the artillery batteries positioned 2 miles offshore, it was precise coordinates for a bombardment that would shatter the forming Japanese assault before it could launch. The voice belonged to Private First Class Samuel Begay, a Navajo from the high desert country of Arizona, and the language he spoke was his mother tongue, a language that had survived centuries of suppression, that had been beaten out of children in government boarding schools, that American officials had once tried to eradicate as a barrier to assimilation. Now, in the crucible of the Pacific War, that same language had become the most valuable weapon the United States Marine Corps possessed. The Japanese had broken American codes before. They had intercepted messages, predicted movements, ambushed landing forces. But the Navajo Code, Diné Bizad, adapted for modern warfare, remained unbroken, unbreakable, incomprehensible to an enemy that had built its intelligence apparatus on assumptions about how language and encryption worked. The shells began to fall exactly where Begay had directed them, and the Japanese assault dissolved into chaos before it could form. Another transmission sent, another position reported, another mission accomplished in a language the enemy could hear but never understand. To comprehend how the Navajo language became the unbreakable code of the Pacific theater requires understanding what the Japanese expected from American communications security and how thoroughly those expectations were mistaken. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had invested heavily in signals intelligence throughout the 1930s. Japanese cryptographers had studied European and American encryption methods, had broken British codes in Southeast Asia, had intercepted and decrypted American diplomatic communications before Pearl Harbor. The Purple Machine, Japan's own encryption device, was considered nearly unbreakable until American cryptographers at Station Hypo cracked it in 1940, giving the United States access to Japanese diplomatic traffic throughout the war. But Japan's confidence in their own signals intelligence capabilities remained high. They assumed that American military communications, like all modern military communications, would rely on mechanical encryption devices or code books, systems that, given enough intercepts and enough time, could be broken through mathematical analysis and linguistic patterns. What Japanese intelligence had not anticipated was that the Americans would abandon mechanical encryption entirely for tactical communications and instead employ a living language as the encryption itself, a language spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, a language with no written form standardized for military use, a language whose grammar and syntax bore no relation to any language Japanese cryptographers had encountered. The Navajo Code Talkers did not encrypt English into Navajo. They spoke in Navajo using a specialized vocabulary that transformed military terminology into words drawn from the natural world and traditional Navajo culture. A fighter plane became Dahetihi, hummingbird. A battleship became Lotso, whale. A commanding officer became BKH, war chief. The code existed in the minds of men who had learned it through intensive training, who could transmit and receive at speeds that made mechanical encryption obsolete,
who represented a cryptographic system that could not be stolen, could not be captured in a code book, could not be broken because there was nothing mechanical to break. The Japanese first encountered Navajo transmissions in late 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. Intelligence officers noted communications in an unknown language, assumed it was a temporary field expedient, and waited for the Americans to revert to standard encryption methods. The transmissions continued. Japanese linguists were brought in to analyze the recordings. They identified it as a Native American language, possibly from the southwestern United States, but could not determine which tribe or reconstruct the vocabulary system being used. Attempts to capture code talkers alive for interrogation failed. The Marines protected them with dedicated security, knowing that the code's security depended on the enemy never obtaining a translator. By 1943, Japanese intelligence had accumulated hundreds of hours of Navajo transmissions and remained no closer to breaking the code than the day they first intercepted it. Analysis reports to Imperial headquarters noted with increasing frustration that American tactical communications appeared to be immune to cryptographic attack. The Americans were coordinating complex amphibious assaults, calling in artillery and air support, transmitting battlefield intelligence, all in a code that resisted every standard cryptographic technique. The transmissions were not encrypted, they were simply in a language that the Japanese could not learn, spoken by men whose cultural and linguistic background was as foreign to Japan as anything on Earth. The contrast between what Japanese commanders expected and what they encountered became a widening gap that cost them battle after battle.
Japanese doctrine emphasized signals intelligence as a force multiplier. Their own operations relied heavily on radio intercepts to anticipate American movements. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Japanese forces had achieved tactical surprises by reading American communications, by predicting where invasions would occur, by positioning forces to meet American assaults. The Navajo Code removed that advantage completely. When Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese defenders on the island could hear the American communications directing the assault, could hear the constant flow of tactical information, could monitor every frequency, but could understand nothing. The voice that had once given them warning now gave them only incomprehensible sound. Major Yoshio Kobayashi, an intelligence officer captured on Okinawa in May 1945, later described the psychological impact of the Navajo Code transmissions in interrogation. The Americans, he said, spoke continuously on open frequencies with no apparent concern for interception. Japanese listening posts recorded everything, sent it for analysis, received nothing useful in return. The effect was demoralizing. To know the enemy was coordinating against you, to hear the orders being given, to be unable to understand or counter them. It transformed Japanese signals intelligence from an asset into a source of frustration, a constant reminder that the Americans possessed a communication security that could not be compromised. The symbol that came to represent this transformation was the radio itself, specifically the American SCR-300 backpack radio that the Navajo Code Talkers carried. Weighing 35 pounds, bulky and conspicuous, the SCR-300 made its operator a priority target for Japanese snipers. But the radio and the voice that spoke through it represented something more significant than tactical communications. It represented the American capacity to adapt, to find unconventional solutions to military problems, to weaponize aspects of American culture that enemies dismissed or underestimated. The Japanese had studied American technology and industrial capacity. They had not studied American diversity.
had not considered that a nation of immigrants and indigenous peoples might possess linguistic resources that homogeneous societies lacked. The Navajo Code Talkers themselves embodied contradictions that the Japanese worldview could not process. These were men whose people had been conquered by the United States in the 1860s, who had been forced onto reservations, whose children had been taken to boarding schools where speaking Navajo was punished with beatings. The assimilation campaigns of the early 20th century had tried to erase Navajo language and culture, had declared that Indians must abandon their traditions to become Americans. Yet here, in the most critical battles of the Pacific War, the Marine Corps depended entirely on men who had retained their language and culture despite generations of suppression. The same government that had once tried to eliminate Navajo now recruited Navajo speakers with urgency, trained them with care, and protected them as assets more valuable than any encryption machine.
The numbers tell part of the story. By 1945, more than 400 Navajo Code Talkers had served in the Pacific Theater. They participated in every major marine assault from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. During the first 48 hours of the Iwo Jima invasion, 6 Code Talkers working around the clock transmitted more than 800 messages without error. The speed and accuracy of Navajo transmissions gave American commanders real-time battlefield intelligence that mechanical encryption could not match. A message that would take 30 minutes to encrypt, transmit, and decrypt using standard codes could be sent in Navajo in seconds. In the chaos of amphibious assault, when minutes determined whether reinforcements arrived in time or artillery struck the right position, that speed was decisive. Japanese commanders, reading after-action reports that described American coordination as impossibly precise, as seeming to anticipate Japanese movements before they occurred, were experiencing the effect of a communication system they could not compromise. American forces were not prescient. They were simply operating inside a secure communications network, while Japanese forces operated in an environment where their own communications were increasingly vulnerable to American intercepts. The asymmetry in signals intelligence reversed the advantage Japan had enjoyed earlier in the war. The transformation this created extended beyond individual battles. Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific relied on positioning forces to meet predictable American objectives, airfields, harbors, strategic islands. But American operational planning, communicated through Navajo Code, remained opaque to Japanese intelligence. When Marines bypassed heavily defended islands and struck at unexpected locations, when amphibious task forces appeared at beaches that Japanese planning had considered unlikely, it was often because American commanders could coordinate complex operations without fear of interception revealing their intentions. The code did not just protect tactical communications, it protected strategic planning, making American operations unpredictable in ways that undermined Japanese defensive doctrine. By 1944, captured Japanese documents reveal a shift in how intelligence officers discussed American communications security. Early reports express confidence that American codes would be broken with sufficient effort. Later documents acknowledge that certain American tactical communications, those using unknown indigenous language, appear to be cryptographically invulnerable. A training memo from the Japanese Intelligence School dated November 1944 instructs students that American communications in certain Pacific sectors should be monitored for traffic analysis only, as content analysis had proven unproductive. This was an admission of cryptographic defeat, the acknowledgement that an enemy communication system existed that could not be broken by any available method. The irony would have been apparent to the Navajo Code Talkers themselves had they been shown these Japanese intelligence assessments. The language that American authorities had spent decades trying to erase, that had been branded as primitive and unsuitable for modern life, had proven more sophisticated than any machine cipher, more secure than any code book. The oral tradition that government schools had dismissed as backward had preserved grammatical complexity and vocabulary depth that made Navajo ideal for military adaptation. The very features that made Navajo difficult for outsiders to learn, its verb-based grammar, its tonal elements, its incorporation of subtle conceptual distinctions, made it impossible for Japanese cryptographers to crack. The Code Talkers did not see themselves as proving anything to the American government. Most were young men in their late teens or early 20s when they enlisted, motivated by patriotism and the promise of adventure, by the desire to serve despite the discrimination they had experienced. But they carried with them the knowledge that their contribution was unique, that they possessed something the military needed desperately and could not obtain elsewhere. In a military that remained racially segregated, where Japanese Americans were interned as security risks and African Americans served in segregated units, the Navajo Code Talkers operated in integrated Marine units, respected and protected because their skill was irreplaceable. The radio, that 35-pound symbol of American communications supremacy, crackled constantly during Pacific operations. Each transmission in Navajo was a small assertion of cultural survival, a demonstration that indigenous language and modern warfare were not incompatible, that diversity was not weakness but strategic advantage. The Japanese, listening on their own receivers, heard only incomprehensible syllables, never understanding that they were hearing the sound of their own intelligence failure, the audio signature of assumptions proven wrong. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, the Navajo Code remained unbroken. Japanese forces surrendered on island after island, their defensive plans compromised by American signals intelligence, while their own intercept efforts provided nothing useful. The final battles, Iwo Jima with its 36 days of mechanized slaughter, Okinawa with its 82 days of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific, were fought with the Navajo Code providing the communications infrastructure for American operations. Japanese commanders, in their surrender meetings, asked American officers about various aspects of American military superiority. Some asked about the code their forces had never broken. When told it was Navajo, a Native American language, several expressed disbelief. How could a primitive tribal language serve as military encryption? The question revealed the depth of their misunderstanding, the assumption that indigenous languages were simple, that traditional cultures had nothing to offer modern warfare, that the diversity of American society was a liability rather than an asset.
The larger truth that the Navajo Code illuminated extended far beyond cryptography or the Pacific War. Japan had built its empire on an ideology of racial and cultural homogeneity, on the belief that unity of blood and tradition created strength. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was premised on Japanese cultural superiority, on the right of Japan to rule over conquered peoples who would benefit from Japanese civilization. This ideology left no room for the possibility that diversity itself could be a source of power, that a nation composed of many peoples and languages might possess capabilities that homogeneous societies lacked. The United States had its own profound failures of racial justice, segregation, internment, discrimination against the very people whose language was protecting American communications. But the pragmatic necessity of war forced a recognition, however incomplete and inconsistent, that indigenous knowledge and cultural distinctiveness had strategic value. The Navajo Code Talkers succeeded not despite their cultural identity, but because of it, because they possessed linguistic and cultural resources that the dominant culture had tried to destroy but had failed to eliminate. The radio transmissions that carried Navajo words across Pacific battlefields were transmitting more than tactical information. They were transmitting evidence that cultural suppression had failed, that indigenous peoples had preserved their languages and traditions through generations of pressure to assimilate, and that those preserved traditions now served purposes their suppressors had never imagined. Every successful assault, coordinated through Navajo Code, was an assertion of cultural survival, a demonstration that the languages and peoples that American policy had sought to erase possessed undeniable value when allowed to exist on their own terms. The Japanese never broke the code because they were listening for something that did not exist, a mathematical cipher, a mechanical encryption, a system that could be reduced to patterns and analyzed through techniques developed for breaking European languages and codes. They were not equipped intellectually or linguistically to understand that the code was not encrypted at all, but simply spoken in a language that required a lifetime of cultural immersion to learn, that existed in oral tradition and communal knowledge rather than written manuals. The failure was not of Japanese intelligence capabilities, but of assumptions about what constituted cryptographic security, about what resources modern warfare could draw upon, about which cultures and languages were relevant to military power.
When the war ended and the Code Talkers returned to the Navajo Nation, they returned to reservation poverty, to continued discrimination, to a society that had not yet recognized their contribution. The code itself remained classified until 1968, preventing them from speaking publicly about their service for more than 2 decades. The irony was acute. Men who had used their language to protect American forces were forbidden to speak about that use by the same government that had once forbidden them to speak their language at all. But history remembers, even when governments try to classify it into silence. The Navajo Code stands in the historical record as the only military code never broken by enemy forces during combat, as proof that cultural diversity provides strategic advantages that homogeneous societies cannot replicate, as evidence that indigenous knowledge and tradition possess value that cannot be measured by the standards of dominant cultures. The radio that carried Navajo words across Pacific waters was transmitting a truth that the Japanese military and American society was slow to accept, that strength comes from diversity, that preservation of cultural distinctiveness enriches rather than weakens nations, that the languages and peoples that governments seek to suppress may possess exactly the resources those same governments desperately need. The volcanic slopes of Saipan are quiet now, the bunkers collapsed, the radio frequencies silent. But the lesson transmitted from those slopes remains active, a standing challenge to assumptions about cultural homogeneity and national strength. The Japanese commanders who underestimated the Navajo Code learned too late that the most unbreakable code is not the most complex mathematics, but the living language of a people whose culture survived against all efforts to eliminate it. That survival and the service it enabled stands as testimony to a truth more durable than any empire, that what makes people different is often what makes them invaluable, and that the voice speaking in a language others cannot understand may be speaking the words that determine who wins and who loses, who survives and who falls, whose vision of the world will endure, and whose will dissolve like radio static into the unlistening air.